Greetings, everyone, and welcome today to a very special presentation on behalf of Thompson's company, 2nd York, for Heritage Mississauga, regarding a very special research and living history project involving a look at the opposite lens of the War of 1812 through looking at the American perspective of the war, specifically through the lens of the New York Militia, and understanding the ways in which this experience was not just one of the opposing side, but also the way in which it was parallel to that of the York Militia, which we conventionally look at. What characterized the particularities and differences of the New York Militia, the roles and responses that they had within the War of 1812, as well as what looking at the New York Militia through a comparative perspective with the York Militia can tell us about the role of the citizen soldier in general throughout the period of the war. In many ways, this project is an application of the same research mission and ethos in use by Thompson's company, that of attempting to understand the role of militia within the war and rectifying the historical blind spot that is militia service during the War of 1812 in general, and being able to surface their experiences. Here, of course, extending into the context of Northern New York State and understanding New Yorkers and their role within the War of 1812. Now, one would ask why, in choosing to depict an American perspective, would in particular we choose that of New York State during the War of 1812? And of course, the answer of the militia has one thing to do with it, certainly in understanding and rectifying the historical blind spot of militia service, not just within the context of Upper Canada, but also within New York on the whole. But also another perhaps answer to provide here would be its geographic proximity and its importance within the war, and that New York was a rather important state because it was the main military and supply hub for the U.S. military and for the New York militia over the course of the war, acting as the main base of operations for several invasions in Upper Canada, some into Lower Canada, and even naval operations on Lake Ontario itself. And another may have to do with the profound role that the New York militia had over the course of the war itself, and given its size, the multiplicity of experience that was characterized by New York militia service in the War of 1812. The New York militia is reported to have had well over 60,000 men serving in total over the course of the entire war. To put that into perspective, with of course some fluctuations over the course of the war, the peak of militia service in Upper Canada was around 10 to 11,000 in total. New York, of course, had, as I stated before, well over 60,000, including specialist troops of various calibers, such as light troops, riflemen, artillerists, and cavalry. In many ways, it could be said to be an army in its own right. But the participation in the New York militia during the course of the War of 1812 wasn't entirely wholesale, and this is what presents another interesting facet of it. In general, militia, American militia in the War of 1812 existed on, one would say, two axes, and New York was squarely in between these two axes. The first being that of election not to participate within the war itself, such as, for example, in New England. The unpopularity of the war within many states of the United States of America made it so that many chose not to actively participate within the war and elected not to field their militia, therefore not providing their own military reserves to the war effort or enacting as any form of base of operations for the U.S. military and its invasions in Upper Canada during the course of the conflict. On the other hand, you have experiences of the war, such as those of the Kentucky militia, which was disproportionately represented in the War of 1812 and which was enthusiastic and very active in how it fielded this militia over the course of the war. New York, having such a very large militia army and being on the forefront of the war, was somewhat of an in-between. One might say even balanced in some ways, where many New Yorkers did not participate in the war actively, simply choosing to take part in defense and support duties, but some choosing to support American troops on the Niagara Peninsula, and even fewer actually crossing the Niagara River and taking part in U.S. military operations in the War of 1812. Having the chance to research and study as well as recreate the New York militia through living history offers a chance to look at, just like with the Upper Canadian militia, the various roles that characterized citizen soldiers during the War of 1812, not just through active military service, but also through support roles and the responses that people had to service through means of choosing perhaps not to participate or to limit their participation, or even in some cases to have very active participation over the course of the war. Now, a third and important reason for also choosing to pick the New York militia in particular is the availability of information. Balance here is also the key word once again. Information on the New York militia is not too scant, but it's also not entirely comprehensive and thorough, which means there are still a great degree of gaps in the record that need to be addressed through further research and study. But especially in the case of reenacting, where a uniform is key to the visual representation and iconography of a unit and being able to recreate it through living history, our resources regarding the uniform of the New York Militia are especially valuable. We're very fortunate to have a number of artifacts and sources regarding the New York Militia from this period that survive to this day, including, and especially rare, surviving uniforms from the War of 1812 itself, which helped to recreate and reconstruct the appearance of the militia over the course of the war. As you can see on this slide, for example, pictured here is from Canada's own War Museum, a uniform of a lieutenant colonel from the War of 1812 of the New York Militia. And from this uniform, we're able not just to have a picture of what an officer would have looked like during the period of the war, but also to know what enlisted men would have looked like, because New York Militia officer and enlisted men's uniforms, with some exceptions, of course, would have been virtually identical. Of course, small minutiae defined and distinguished the uniform of an officer, such as the presence of lace, unique buttons, and unique sewing patterns on the tails, for example, as well as in the overall quality of make. But generally speaking, they were identical. And this offers an interesting point through which to examine the evolution of the uniform of the New York Militia over the course of the War of 1812, where further research and gaps exist, and rectification is most certainly required. Because while we do know what the pre-war pattern, which is what the New York Militia would have worn over the course of the war, was certainly extensively used, it becomes more difficult to understand what the New York Militia would have looked like throughout the rest of the war and how their appearance would have evolved, especially those active regiments in the Niagara frontier that were brigaded with other active militia regiments and with regular U.S. soldiers. For example, we do know that around mid-1813 and 1814, blue and gray coats begin to be issued to American regulars on the Niagara frontier. And there is a possibility that New York Militia that was brigaded with American armies composed largely of regulars may have received these uniforms, given the fact that they were issued on a brigade basis, especially the mid-1813 blue uniform and the rather famous 1814 gray uniform used by Scott's Brigade in the 1814 invasions of Upper Canada. So this is in some ways a blind spot that provides an interesting challenge and that will hopefully present an interesting avenue to explore in attempting to recreate the unit through living history. Now, that being said, with all this great deal of information that exists on the New York Militia, of course, we want to still be able to transform all this research and writing from the static realm of paper to the dynamic realm of historical animation and living history. And of course, as is the case with the Second New York Militia, it's important to pick a specific regiment to portray over the course of the war, one that is tied to a specific region and that will allow for portraying specific experiences, one that is also appropriate to being able to, one that is also appropriate to the War of 1812 in general because of its activity, especially on the Niagara frontier, where Second New York is especially present and especially reenacts, but also a regiment that in some ways can act as a microcosm for the broader experiences of militia in general over the course of the War of 1812. And after some deliberation, it was arrived to pick the 19th Regiment of New York Militia. This regiment is particularly interesting because, again, the key word here with it is balance. This is a regiment about which much is known, but also a lot isn't known. There are still gaps in its record of service and its history that remain unknown to this day. But in general, what we do know about the 19th Regiment, which is otherwise known as Bloom's Regiment of Militia, named for its officer, Lieutenant Colonel Henry Bloom, is that this regiment was present at the very start of the war, at the very end of the war. And it's exceptional in that its activity over the course of the war was characterized by direct fighting and presence on the Niagara frontier, which was especially rare because over the course of the War of 1812, many New York militia simply did not participate actively on the Niagara frontier, and fewer even would have fought directly with and alongside the United States Army. The 19th is exceptional in this regard. It's recorded, for example, on the standing orders of the War of 1812 at the very beginning, where under General Van Rensselaer, the New York militia regiments were brigaded into various units. And the 19th Regiment was put in the 7th Brigade. As you can see, it's at the very bottom end there. Henry Bloom of Genoa, Cayuga County, the 19th Regiment. And these regiments in general, when they arrived to the Niagara frontier, Many of them simply chose not to cross Niagara River. Of course, in a rather famous case, citing, and this is another thing that characterizes New York responses to the War of 1812, citing the fact that they had no obligation to invade Upper Canada and that the limit of their duty extended simply to protecting the state of New York itself. The 19th was one of those few regiments that actually crossed and was present at the Battle of Queenston Heights. It's also recorded at the very end of the war to have served at the Battle of Lundy's Lane in July of 1814, therefore making it have a more comprehensive and active record of service than most of its counterpart regiments during the War of 1812, especially for a militia regiment. Now, of course, this does present further gaps because it's not known over the course of the period between 1812, where it was known to have participated at Queenston Heights, and 1814, where it was known to have been at Lundy's Lane. It's not entirely known where the 19th Regiment would have been. And this is another thing that makes it interesting to reconstruct. Later sources, such as this newspaper excerpt from the Ethica Daily News, which comes from about 90 years later, seems to state that the 19th Regiment of New York was present on the Canadian frontier for about 2 years, which would imply that there was a continuity to its service from October of 1812 to July of 1814. But then again, of course, it's important to corroborate the fact the facts that come from the source, given especially that it's a much later source from 1902. And even if we are to take the source itself at face value, it's still important. We still don't have an entirely extensive picture of what their service would have looked like. Did the 19th New York simply exist on the frontier for this duration of 2 years in the support role, in the reserve role, in the garrison role? Did it actually participate in some of the battles that occurred in 1813, for example? Not much is known other than the 2 battles at which it existed. But interestingly enough, its presence at the Battle of Queenston Heights and Lundy's Lane tells us that it was present at least 2 battles that we know of, at which the 2nd Regiment of York was also present, meaning that it was on a simultaneous battlefield with the 2nd Regiment of York on 2 instances at the very least that are known, and that it would have been on the opposing side. Who knows? Perhaps they may have even crossed paths, and this makes for a rather interesting connection to the 2nd Regiment of York Militia as well. Now, in general, this, I think, provides a rather interesting launching point through which to create the living history subunit to examine New York experiences in the War of 1812. And the hope is to eventually use the 19th Regiment to understand the particularity of experiences of the New York Militia and to broaden the portrait that we have of this time period and of the service of the New York Militia during the War of 1812, as well as to shed light on what the roles of the militia in general would have been like over the course of the War of 1812 and how they would have been affected by this conflict that they would have been thrust into. Now, thank you kindly for tuning into this presentation, and an especially great thank you to Rama Gaming House and Charity for their very generous financial support of historical research and awareness programs such as these. They certainly help not just to color the world of living history and historical reenactment in general, but also to help us further understand and expand upon our research and interpretation of the history of the War of 1812 in general. Thank you once again for tuning in.